Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said back in May, Australians know there is no money tree. What he was saying is that you can't just print money, there's nowhere to get money apart from earning it the hard way. And that's the same way that Australia should run its budget, like a household budget. Watch your costs, make sure they don't exceed your income. Today he did a majestic reverse ferret. It was an absolutely spectacular backflip, and it was just hard on the heels of Paul Keating, the former Prime Minister, who said we should be not tightening the belt right now, pulling off JobKeeper and JobSeeker. We should be raising billions of dollars using the Reserve Bank to kickstart the economy. Lo and behold, a day later, Josh Frydenberg has found the money tree. He said, let's do this stimulus. Now, the money tree is actually creating new money. This is what MMT, or modern monetary theorists, call the practice of the Reserve Bank buying bonds. Now, Keating suggested the Reserve Bank buy bonds or create new money from the government, directly from the government. And the government's madly running around saying, we don't want to be like Venezuela and we can't, there's no money tree and so on. But in the past few months, it has created $52 billion in new money. This is the money tree. And it's done it this way. It's a triangle. There are 3 steps to the process. Step number 1, the government issues bonds or debt securities. 3-year bonds mostly in this case. The banks buy the bonds from the government, and then the RBA, the Reserve Bank, buys the bonds from the banks. In this way, the government and the RBA can say, oh, we're not creating money. We're buying it from the banks. These are private operators. But when they buy the bonds from the banks, they create new money. They simply credit the accounts of the big banks with the money for the purchase of the bonds. $52 billion in extra money supply. Now, there's another little wrinkle to this at the moment, which nobody seems to have picked up on, and that's called the TFF, the Term Funding Facility. This was a thing that was announced a few months back at the zenith of COVID. It was a $200 billion fund, which has now gone, I think, to $300 billion. It's a cheap financing. It's a cheap source of financing for the banks. $300 billion at 0.25%, bargain basement, interest rate. Very cheap money. The Reserve Bank, according to Guy Debelle, who's an assistant governor there, who gave a speech this week, he made it known that the Reserve, on the QT, he made it known that the banks can actually use this money, this cheap financing money from the Reserve Bank, to buy government bonds. Now, the banks have been making a killing trading government bonds recently. They've got all this incredibly cheap money. They've drawn down about $60 or $70 billion of the TFF so far. That's the Term Funding Facility. Now what they're going to do is potentially buy more, using this dirt cheap money from the government, from the Reserve Bank, to buy bonds from the government, and then the Reserve Bank can go and buy the bonds back from the banks, creating billions more in new money. Printing money, they call it in the vernacular. That's what's going on. The governments and the Reserve Bank has yet to actually fess up to this, because there's a lot of ideology and a lot of history, economic sort of feeling and emotion around this idea of printing money. And there's a little debate going on between the MMT, the modern monetary theorists, and the traditional economists as to what is appropriate. But the guts of it is, Josh Frydenberg has found the money tree. The government, via the Reserve Bank, is creating new money. It's happening. The question is, when the banks are credited with the money from the Reserve Bank, what do they do with it? Are they going to lend it? They've got this money that they're borrowing at 0.25%, 1/4%, billions of it. Are they going to lend it? That's what the government wants to do. That's what the Reserve Bank wants them to do. They have put the ball squarely in the court of the banks. The next move is with the banks. Are they going to lend the money to kickstart the COVID economy?